wonder who recorded that voice, but anyway, nonetheless, so we'll get started. Keep it pretty high level, formal, casual. I know everyone's kind of on their own ESG journey. I certainly am myself, so kind of tried to put something together that helps folks that don't have any background, help folks that have some background, and hopefully fits kind of the middle. And we can, chat things through, answer questions, talk as we go. So don't hesitate to interrupt me, or if I use a term that doesn't make any sense or you get lost. Let's not have that happen. Let's all stay on this together. So let's dive in and let's see how this technology works for y'all. So does that look okay? Folks can see stuff. This is meta because it's me and me. But anyway, so if I know most of you, but if you don't know who I am, my name is Nicole Namer. I own Sustainable Strategies. I'm a lawyer, as well as I hold a bunch of different sustainable building credentials. So my main focus right now is my company, Sustainable Strategies. We do sustainability consulting. I also always need to be clear on things like this, that none of this is legal advice. I'm here as a sustainability consultant and educator. And I'm also an honorary member of AIA. So that was a pretty cool thing to be awarded last year. So that's me. Let's move on to our agenda. A couple things I am hoping to cover here that are really grounded in some of the most common questions that I get asked. So what is ESG and where did it come from? Kind of like, why is it everywhere right now? What are some of the key terms, frameworks, and strategies? What are some of the intersections of ESG with design, or probably more broadly, all of AEC? This is going to get obnoxiously acronym rich, so I apologize in advance, but it's just kind of the nature of what we have going on here. I see ESG kind of talked about by a lot of folks as kind of a burden. So a lot of my focus is to try to flip it to an opportunity. How can we see ESG as an opportunity to meaningfully contribute in this conversation? So I've put some stuff in here about how to leverage ESG to better serve existing clients, attract new clients, particularly for small, diverse businesses like mine, architecture firms or others. What are some of the impact areas where design aligns with ESG? Some of the metrics and reporting frameworks that are out there. We'll go through those. Don't worry if you don't know what they are. Really how to, again, with that theme of opportunity, how to position your work to support your clients' ESG goals, and what are some of the tools and resources and crosswalks that are available that particularly are useful to folks in AEC, because let's not recreate the wheel, right? Let's use what's out there. Let's find the good tools and go from there. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to cover in the next 45 or so minutes. So we'll start from there. So what is ESG? It is evolving, nascent, difficult to define, acronym rich. I was on a podcast the other day and I was saying that if you ask 10 different ESG practitioners to define ESG, you would get 10 different answers, and I think none of them would be wrong, probably. It is not necessarily a new thing, but the themes that support ESG have been around for a while. Packaging the way that we do for ESG is what's, I think, kind of new. And so so that's what kind of makes it difficult to define with all things that are kind of new. The easiest or way that I think about it is it's really capturing, analyzing, and reporting a variety of different metrics that loosely fall into these buckets that we've created of environmental, social, and governance. And I'll go through some examples of each of those if you're like, I don't know what that is. The data points are, kind of evolving as well. And there's a variety of reporting frameworks, both voluntary and structures that pull publicly available data. And I'll show you some examples of those in a minute. Another way that I like to think about it, a lot of my work for folks who know me is managing the risks of sustainable innovation. And so I like to look at ESG as a risk evaluation and management tool. I think we can use it that way. Of importance to folks like service providers, like AEC folks, it really has impacts throughout the supply chain, not just large publicly traded companies. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And bottom line really is, no matter where ESG goes, no matter what kind of criticisms the New York Times come out, no matter kind of how it actually evolves, it really is a business baseline at this point. More than, there was some McKinsey study out there that says more than 90% of the S&P 500 put out some type of ESG report. Some type is really the key phrase here. Some are good, some are not great, some are greenwashing, somewhere in the middle. Like anything that's newish, like ESG, there's a lot of opportunity for intentional and unintentional greenwashing. So there's a lot of things to be aware of. But I think the big point to take home is that ESG is not going to go away. It may shift, it may take different forms, we may call it different things, it may evolve, subject to criticisms, but it's going to stick around. It's a better way to do business. So that's kind of the way that I like to think about it. Just kind of reinforcing some of those concepts here. It's really, again, this way to measure, analyze, and communicate information that fits in those buckets. And we use very similar to sustainable building, where we talk about a LEED certified building is a green building. We have shorthand frameworks that really attempt to create similarly a common language around a really complex concept, like how is a business operating with respect to environmental, social, and governance factors. So there's a lot of parallels I think we can draw from like early, I don't like this term, I know a lot of people don't either, but like green building, I'm just using it because it's easy. Early days of green building to the kind of current early days of ESG, some of the problems and challenges and ways that we think ESG will change, we saw and kind of dealt with in the early days of green building. And I guess another way to think about it, because I know it is a little confusing, is kind of like a multi-dimensional credit score. If you think about credit scores as being used to evaluate a borrower's risk. So kind of one way to think about it, and sort of oversimplifying, but just trying to help folks understand. Another way to think about it, my friends over at Stoke kind of have a report that they put out where if you think about CSR or corporate social responsibility, how that's kind of changed or evolved and gotten more robust to be kind of repackaged as ESG. So that might be another way to think about it if you're struggling with the concept. And also, don't worry, you're not alone. So that's kind of a way to think about ESG. Pulled a couple other quotes that I think are helpful, how other folks have observed or commented on ESG to kind of make it useful. This is a quote from Persephone. They tend to put out a lot of, I found, really good ESG related information. So this is a quote from one of their materials that basically says, environmental, social, and governance are three overarching pillars that an organization's effect on the environment and society can be measured. It's initially used as a tool for investors to understand a company's long-term financial performance. That's really where ESG came from. ESG is now central to business strategies. It assesses the company's ability to deal with the defining issues of our time: climate crisis, environmental degradation, social injustice, and inequality. So I think that's kind of a good way to summarize ESG. Just one more from Thomson Reuters, and then we'll kind of like move on from our definition stage, but I know ESG is difficult to think about and define. So let's go through one more example. In its most basic form, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. Collectively, it represents the ethical, moral, and cultural standards and processes in which a company is committed to operate. For key stakeholders and investors, it's used to evaluate potential investment in a company. So it's an investment risk tool. For employees and external vendors, it provides a window into the business's culture and priorities. So another, I think, way to think about it from Thomson Reuters. And then just one more quote here: sufficiently addressing ESG is no longer an environmental and social problem. It's now an issue with repercussions for many companies' bottom lines. It leaves a pretty big question, I think, in a lot of folks' minds if you don't produce some type of ESG report or robust ESG information. That'll change as the landscape is changing, as we're seeing ESG potentially being regulated in the US. We'll get to that in a minute. But again, just kind of closing out this kind of intro part of our conversation, it's really bundling and categorizing a variety of risk management strategies. That's really the way that I look at it. Does that land okay with everybody? All right, thumbs up, heads aren't spinning. It's Friday, I know it's tough. All right, so let's move on from that a little bit. And when I talk about ESG, folks are kind of like tend to get the E, but we are like, what is the S and what is the G? So I know this is pretty small. Let me zoom in here. These are just some examples of various factors that might fit into each of those buckets. There's many, many more. Just giving you a smattering here. So environmental things that folks in AEC are pretty familiar with, right? Net zero decarbonization strategies, water and other resource efficiency. What are your company's environmental policies? If we're looking at some of the social aspects that might fall into ESG, human rights and working conditions, diversity, equity, inclusion. There's a lot of intersections with DEI work and ESG. I know that gets acronym rich, so I just apologize in advance. Community relations and stakeholder engagement. You might think about things like developing a new project, and are you just dropping a building into a space, or are you considering the long-term impacts to the fabric of that community, engaging with community stakeholders, things like that. Governance looks at things like compensation policies, cybersecurity, other risk management things, and cybersecurity, bribery, anti-corruption, things like that. So those are just some examples. There's many more, but just to kind of particularly help folks understand the S and the G, because I think those are a little bit more amorphous. Folks in our industry are really familiar with E and like carbon accounting and things like that. That's not all that the E covers, but just to kind of have that framework. Another thing that's super important to keep in mind is even though we as humans put things in buckets like E, S, and G, it's probably obvious, but worth reinforcing here, there's significant overlap between each of these things, right? We can't talk about environmental impacts without talking about social impacts, governance, same thing. So even though we kind of, for like really academic purposes, or the way that our brains work, put things in different buckets, there are overlaps, and it's important, I think, to keep acknowledging that, because it helps us get a more holistic picture of risk and opportunities as well. So worth noting that. So there's a lot of acronyms, and so I made this slide to kind of try to tackle some of the big ones. And so let's just kind of dive into that. So what are some of the common frameworks for ESG reporting? Just to set kind of a table stakes, we'll dive into these a little bit more, but I want to keep it at a pretty high level. So there's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. That one comes up a lot because I'm so hesitant to use so many acronyms here, but the SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commission, has pending climate disclosure rules. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but those are largely based on TCFD. That's why it's talked about a lot. There's GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, CDP, science-based targets, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and GRES, which relates really specifically to real estate. Folks heard any of these acronyms before? Maybe, yeah, maybe worked under the Sustainable Development Goals, things like that. Yep, definitely. So they're out there. There's more than this, obviously, that relate to ESG, and these also relate to other things, obviously, as well. Where, again, this is kind of like, I think about bundling and kind of recategorizing a bunch of different stuff is how we think about ESG. To help either clear or muddy the waters, this is one of my favorite charts. This is from our friends over at Verdani Institute. If you haven't seen this report, it's really helpful. But what they did was they basically took some of the top ESG reporting frameworks and broke them down and categorized them. So with the nice little logos, which makes it easier to see. So they took kind of some of the standards and guidance frameworks, ones I just went over, like GRI, Sustainable Development Goals, TCFD, things that really provide recommendations or methodologies for improving performance in each of those areas. Then there's voluntary disclosure frameworks, which are really questionnaires, kind of result in scores. GRES really falls within there. You get a GRES score at the end of the day. There's some involuntary third-party aggregators, which will just pull publicly available data and score you. There's net zero emissions initiatives, which we're seeing more and more of these every day. There's so many at this point, I can't keep track. And then regulations, probably the ones that we're hearing, probably the one that we're hearing the most about here in the US is the Securities and Exchange Commission's pending rules, which I'll talk about in a minute. There are many others. There's impacts for companies that operate outside the US jurisdiction. So it is kind of a mess, for lack of a better way to put it right now. But I think this chart is really helpful. You can download that report. What's also interesting to me, and I do a lot of talking about whether I do webinars or things like this, is that ESG is at this interesting tension point that we don't see a lot, which is that we have market forces pushing for transparency on all of these, everything that falls within these three buckets. And we also have regulatory requirements kind of cascading or crashing into them. Usually, or kind of in the past, we've tended to see, at least in the US, either a market-driven movement or a regulatory-driven movement. And it's interesting that we're kind of experiencing both. So we see, leading companies, largely tech companies, saying, well, we're going to do this being good ESG, kind of no matter what. And then we have, the federal government saying, all right, we're increasing our enforcement in this area, and I'll go into this in a minute, where we have proposed rules, pending rules out there. So it's kind of interesting. I guess the nerd in me finds it kind of fascinating that we have both market drivers and regulatory requirements kind of hitting at the same time. Question, what's going to happen? I think ultimately we're going to have kind of a regulatory floor that many companies go above, and if it's regulatory, obviously nobody's going to hit that floor. But we'll see. It's kind of a TBD at this point. So what is kind of the regulatory timeline? I wanted to pull a couple of things for you all to just give some context, because there's a lot out there, and I think it can be difficult to parse through. So there's lots of other regulatory things happening, but just to give you a sense of kind of some that are out there and that I've seen come up in my work, and that I see more and more questions asked about, is are these 4 that I have here that I think kind of paint what the future might look like. So March of 2021, y'all can remember then, it was kind of a blur. Securities and Exchange Commission was actually working and doing things, and they announced creation of a climate and ESG task force in the Division of Enforcement. So you can go online and see what companies the SEC is basically going after and saying, hey, your reporting is not in alignment with your website, or your reporting appears to have gaps or inconsistencies. They have definitely stepped up their enforcement. And then in March, the proposed rules that a lot of people have been talking about were issued for public comment. There's a couple of rules that the SEC has pending. I think the one that has the largest focus is called, in classic federal government naming, the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors. The idea really being to standardize and create transparency among publicly traded companies. So that public comment period was extended until June. We were expected to have some rules by October, and there's been a pause on that. Obviously, October's passed, so we'll see. But right now, there are proposed rules out there. And then August, as part of a 10-year review, the Federal Trade Commission, so a different federal entity, FTC, will be soliciting, or they announced they would be soliciting comment and update the green guides. Folks heard of the green guides? No heard of the green guides. Okay. I use it, I think I mentioned this beginning. If I didn't, I teach a sustainable development class at the University of Washington as well. And we talk a lot about the green guide. There are some federal guidance with respect to marketing claims related to sustainability or green. They are 10 years stale now. And so you can imagine how much the world of sustainability has changed in the past decade. I actually think the initial green guides were pretty good, because they were based on a public survey. And so they really look at, what does the average American think about when you say something is green, which, as you can imagine, is varies. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a really high standard for green. In other areas, it's different. And so the green guides are kind of a helpful tool to provide, I think, some guardrails around making environmental claims. They are stale at this point, and they need to be updated, particularly for things like net zero, carbon neutral, all these claims that we're seeing out there right now. But those will be updated soon. And so this is all running in the background, all this kind of different guidance that we're going to get with respect to taking a more serious look at environmental and climate change issues. And then the last one, most recently, the White House Council on Environmental Quality announced major federal suppliers required to disclose their environmental impacts through Common Disclosure Project, which is pretty interesting. And so also demonstrates kind of like how sustainability is flowing through the supply chain, which is really where I think the impacts to AEC are going to come through. There's obviously many other regulatory things going on, both at the federal, state, and local level. But just with respect to ESG, because it is really the requirements are going to come from the Securities and Exchange Commission, at least in the US, focusing on some of the federal issues that are going on in the background, because I think it gives helpful context as to like, why are we here and where are we potentially going to go? I think the bottom line is that environmental claims are going to have, environmental and related claims that for ESG are going to have much higher scrutiny as we move forward. It's probably a good thing, I think. Everybody still with me? Still awake? Nice. Okay, good, great. So how are ESG requirements even going to make a difference in anyone's lives? There's a couple of ways, and some of them are going to be direct. So through the SEC's proposed rules, those are going to be big publicly traded companies who have to file certain documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they'll have to include some standardized disclosures there. So you're like, this isn't me. This is your clients though, right? And so that's where the indirect kind of flow down provisions, I think, are mostly going to come through, as these regulatory requirements, particularly with respect to Scope 3, which many of you probably know, but we'll talk about in a minute, just in case you don't. Things like carbon obviously is going through the supply chain. So, and then there's also market forces at play. So even if a company is that aren't, necessarily subject to the SEC's requirements, I am seeing those companies that do not necessarily have to fall under the umbrella of the SEC's requirements are oftentimes putting out ESG and sustainability like reports anyways. Just because you don't have to doesn't mean that you can't. So you may have clients who are privately held general contractors who decide to do ESG reporting, for example, or architecture firms. Excuse me. So there's lots of different ways I think that these ESG requirements are either going to directly come down through regulation or through the supply chain in one way or another. It's just business as usual now, and taking a lot closer look at all of the different aspects that fall into those three buckets. So general alignment, and then there's some specific references. We're actually seeing some things that we're all familiar in the building design and construction industries, like green building certification systems, show up in ESG reporting. So I want to leave you all with some examples of not only general alignment, but specific references, and we'll talk about those in a minute here. So again, how does this flow through the supply chain? Let me zoom in on this a little bit here. Private companies are making, you've probably seen this, voluntary climate and other commitments at a rapid rate. And many of them are making these commitments and have no idea how to get there. You believe the number of inquiries I get. We just made this like carbon neutral commitment. Now what? So it's interesting. And all of these things are flowing down the supply chain, I guess. So to meaningfully make and keep those commitments related to ESG, companies need to ensure their entire supply chain is compliant, and that includes service providers. So being a lawyer, I've worked with a lot of law firms on these issues, as well as architecture firms, accountants. Service providers are a big part of the actual supply chain. So that is something to keep in mind. I like to give one example because I'm a big fan of Salesforce's work in this space. So like, how is this actually flowing down the supply chain? Here's one example, and you may have gotten more RFPs, RFIs, or other client requests that are asking for things like, they're generally leading with carbon and then asking related questions that may fall under S, sometimes G. But Salesforce is a good example, I think, of what is coming. So let's zoom in on this a little bit here. Many of you probably know the statistic, but supply chains can account for up to 90% climate emissions. This is why whether or not Scope 3 will be part of the SEC's proposed rules, as you can imagine, is a very hot topic, because it can be a little bit more difficult to manage Scope 3. But anyway, so what I have here is a snip of what Salesforce introduced about a year ago. They're calling it their sustainability exhibit, which they have added to all of their vendor supplier contracts, basically requiring their vendor suppliers, everyone in their supply chain, to set science-based targets, work towards them, or there are potential penalties. What I really appreciate about Salesforce's work in this space is, even though there are penalties, you can see even in this little snip that I have here, it may be a bit difficult, but they're really emphasizing collaboration, not punitive issues, right? So collaboration with other corporations, the public sector, and non-governmental organizations is a key step in driving positive change. So they're really inviting their supply chain into these ESG related conversations, as opposed to saying, you figure it out, which I think is the appropriate approach, and also encourage folks who are in the supply chain to reach out to their customers, we'll get to this in a minute, and say like, hey, how can we work together? How can we help you support your ESG goals? That's just being a good client, right? And so this is a great example. This is obviously like a multi-page document. I just kind of pulled the preamble from it. But we're seeing more and more of these types of vendor supplier commitments, because as you can imagine, whatever climate commitment Salesforce made, they're not going to get there unless they get control of their entire supply chain's carbon commitments. Now, this only really relates to carbon. ESG, as we talked about already, is much broader than that. But it's a good step in the right direction in from where I sit, I guess. So where does AEC fit in? Again, I think there's real, if we look at ESG as an opportunity, right? There's real opportunity to align both your firm's operations and your project work with your clients' goals, right? Both of those two things. You can say, hey, pick us because our own operations align with your whatever carbon commitment or whatever social commitment you've made. We support our diversity, our supply chain, whatever the case may be. And or the projects that we build or design for you, we're going to make suggestions and recommendations, and we have the tools to help them align with your ESG goals. If there's like, one takeaway here, it's read your client's ESG reports. If they put one up there, they might call it a sustainability report, they might call it something or other. Most companies have them. I just said the S&P 500, it's 90%. But moving down, I've seen a lot smaller companies have some type of ESG or sustainability report. I won't make you all raise your hands and answer the question whether or not you've actually looked at any of your clients' ESG reports, but it's an interesting adventure to kind of delve through those, and I'll go through some examples in a minute here. But there's that. And so as you can imagine, you can then demonstrate alignment. How is your firm's operations aligning with whatever those goals are? And there may be certification programs that you can either suggest to your clients or that your firm has pursued, because there are lots of references to sustainable building certifications, LEED well, fit well, and others that align with ESG frameworks. There's many other ways, but since we are so used to working under third-party certification programs as building folks, I think that's a good starting point for a lot of people in kind of this overwhelming sea of like, what is ESG? And then study resources, and there's a bunch of examples out there, and I'll go through a couple in a minute here. But if you're not familiar with what are some of the like questions with respect to ESG, so I talked about TCFD, SASB, GRI. These are really just, well, they're all kind of different. They are all different. They really come down to kind of questions about like, how is your company operating? So when XYZ publicly traded company is going to go, okay, we've got to do these various ESG reports, they're largely going to answer questions. And so I want to give, every time I talk about ESG, I like to give just a couple examples so you can kind of think about, and you can go online, you can read the TCFD's questionnaires, you can read CDPs, you can look at the Sustainable Development Goals. I know a lot of people probably have. So let's just go through a couple examples to help give some, I think, texture to the conversation around ESG, because it can be really amorphous. And then companies in their ESG reports report on these metrics. They'll say, well, GRI indicator XYZ, our response is this. So just starting really broadly, I'm just going to give you like 5 or 6 examples so you can kind of have a sense of what they look like. And again, you can go online and find these. So TCFD, the big question is disclose scope 1, 2, and if appropriate, that's obviously a key phrase, 3, emissions and related risks. So a company would respond to this question in their ESG report. Just again, one example from the task force, and I always mess up the actual acronym, but from TCFD basically. And then obviously that's in the environmental kind of bucket of things, right? What are your greenhouse gas emissions? And then friendly reminder or a quick primer on scopes 1, 2, and 3 for folks who don't have that background, because we're all in different places in our journey. Scope 1 is basically your direct and owned emissions. Scope 2 is all the energy that you purchase. And then scope 3 is that potential 90%. It's everything else, including where that little arrow is, service providers. And so something to keep in mind there with respect to scope 1, 2, and 3. So that TCFD is saying, hey, disclose your scope 1, 2, and if appropriate, 3. And as I mentioned earlier, the SEC's proposed rules from the federal government. If you go in, if you want to lose hours of your life and go in and read the public comments, many of them focus on whether or not scope 3 should be a mandatory requirement and what that's ultimately going to look like. And nobody knows for sure, but obviously that's a point of contention. So that was one example. Let's go through another one just to kind of give some more, again, texture to what might a governance related question look like. I call this one governance and environmental. So this is again from TCFD. Disclose the organization's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. Describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. Describe management's role in assessing and managing climate risks and opportunities. So a publicly traded company would respond to this and say, like, this is our management's response. This is how we deal with these risks. Because ultimately, we want to have consumers have the opportunity to weigh the risks, because climate change is the greatest risk that we're facing right now, one of the greatest ones, associated with their process, right? Are you building things in places where the sea level is going to rise very quickly, or superstorms are very prevalent, or whatever the case may be? So a lot of these questions really get at kind of that issue of risk management and assessment with respect to climate change. Hopefully trying to move the needle towards things like not just what are your emissions, but then how are you ultimately going to be working to reduce them so that our climate doesn't change as much as it is. So I wanted to pull a couple examples from different frameworks. This one's from GRI, and this one is an example of what a social question might look like. Again, there's overlap, but I'm just trying to kind of give some texture here. So it would be a description of occupational health and safety training provided to workers, including generic training as well as specific training on work-related hazards, hazardous activities, or hazardous materials. So you can kind of read in between the lines here. What they're really saying is, how are you keeping your people safe? How are you training them? How are you treating them? And how are you making sure that they are prepared and protected for any potential job site hazards, right? And so that's kind of a social bucket way to look at things that comes from GRI, and a company will respond to that. I think one or two more just to give a little bit of texture here. Governance, again, organization describe the process for the highest governance body to ensure the conflicts of interest are prevented and mitigated. Because as you can imagine, if a big company has an issue that shows up in the news about a conflicts of interest issue, some self-dealing, whatever the problem is, that's a risk, right? And so how the organization is run, how they manage potential security, bribery issues, conflicts of interest, other things is important. So do you have a policy in place for that and to try to prevent those types of issues? So that's another example from GRI, trying to give a governance issue. Governance is one of the ones of the three buckets that I think is a little bit more difficult to visualize. What is a governance issue? But it's really, how is the company being run, and all the way down the supply chain, right? How are you looking at suppliers? It can be anything from board diversity to diverse supply chain, which is a lot of work that I do with other entities. Being a diverse supplier, my company is a diverse supplier, so we think a lot about that. You can also kind of think about governance as a lot of the ways that companies enforce maybe the values that they've set forth on the environmental or social side, right? So we're treating our people well. Governance is how the question or the example I just gave of, okay, what kind of training are you providing to help keep them safe? Could be one example. It's kind of the way that I like to think about it. Everybody still with me? Yeah, hopefully less confused than you were when we started, but we'll see. We'll keep going. We're gonna dive into a couple of examples. So like I said, there's a lot of us work in sustainable building. That's why we're AEC folks. So there's kind of ways that sustainable building generally aligns with some ESG frameworks, TCFD, SASB, GRI, all the different annoying acronyms that I shared at the beginning. And there are also some specific references to things like lead well, fit well, and others. So that kind of makes it nice because it's a like check the box, right? So, and then there's many crosswalks. As you can imagine, these third-party certification programs a lot of us work under anyways are very interested in showing how their programs align with ESG, because they know that ESG is just good business sense now, right? So why wouldn't lead well, fit well, and others want to say, hey, here's how our program aligns with XYZ ESG metric. So many acronyms. I'm sorry, I'm annoyed with myself at this point. That's the only way to talk about it. Because it's a business driver and it makes sense. So let's kind of pause on that and go through a couple of examples. So I pulled some ESG reports that specifically reference sustainable building. I'm not saying these are good reports or bad reports. I just tried to kind of get a smattering of different companies that are on different places in their ESG journey. So this one's from Uber. So let's take a look at that. If you've never seen an ESG report, they can be multiple hundreds of pages. This is, I think, page 53 of Uber's. So as you can see, they have their LEED well and well HSR certified facilities highlighted in their ESG report. So they're talking about over the past year, we've achieved LEED well certification in numerous locations, and then they highlight those. So they're saying just generally, hey, we look after our people, we look after our planet, and we're doing that by demonstrating, among lots of other things that are in the first 52 pages and however many pages this goes on for. One of the ways we do that is by emphasizing sustainable, healthy buildings. So one example. Another example, let's zoom in on this one, is from Citi. So they are kind of leveraging their office space to meet their goals and targets. So this is from their ESG report. There's page 51, just trying to give you a sense of how long these things are. You can go online and download any of these reports. They're all available. That's kind of the whole point. So they're saying, okay, we set these 2025 operational footprint goals, which is coming up pretty quick here. And they want 40% of their floor area to be LEED well or equivalent certified, and they're basically almost there. So they set that goal and they're sharing publicly. Remember in the very beginning, I said it's kind of really just like measuring, analyzing, and communicating a variety of things. So this is what they're communicating. Common question that I get asked is like, why are all these things, all these reports different, right? Because there is no standardization requirement in the US. That's what the SEC is kind of trying to do with their proposed rules, and say, okay, these are at least the things you have to disclose. Right now, companies can say, well, we want to pull from this, we want to pull from that, and we want to, like City here, well, we're going to set this 2025 goal and we're going to share it and work towards it. There's not a standard way or form that all companies have to comply with. It makes it really hard on the consumer. As you can imagine, if I wanted to say, well, I want to compare, Uber's probably an easier example, like Uber to Lyft, and I looked at both of their reports, it's not an apples to apples comparison, which makes it difficult on the consumer side. And that's kind of what the SEC, I think, is after in trying to create some standardization. But companies will probably ultimately kind of pick and choose various ways that they want to communicate about their business. And different businesses have different environmental, social, and governance issues and opportunities, right? Citi is a very different company than Uber, than our next example, which is Visa. So it gets confusing. I'll be the first to admit it. And I think it will be confusing for a while, although we will ultimately get some guidance. So one more example, hopefully try to make these things clearer than less. This is page, let's see, 36 of Visa's report. And I kind of pulled out that text that's really small and they can't see very well, but they're just talking about their sustainable operations. And I don't love this term, but greening our offices and data centers. So they're saying, you know, we obtain LEED, BREEAM, Green Mark, or other equivalent for various build outs. They might be a little bit earlier on their sustainable building journey than other companies that get drilled down more specifically. We welcome everyone getting on board here, right? So like we kind of take folks where they are on their journey. And they report metrics in different ways. So this is just another example. And they have all sorts of different metrics, as you can imagine, because they're in that banking financial industry, as opposed to like Uber that has all sorts of physical offices and cars and employees and things moving all over the place. So different businesses, different ways of describing things, clear as mud, right? Folks still with me? Okay, nobody's bored yet. All right, cool. So I talked about kind of, so we just went through some examples of ESG reports. You've never seen one. I would like encourage you, like pick your favorite company or something that you buy something from and go look at their ESG report, just to kind of see what's in it. Tends to be a lot of greenwashing, but I think it's getting better. So if we kind of drill down a little bit more specifically to the built environment, disciplines, one of my goals with doing this was to share resources so people know where they are. And so I want to share this one and some of the ones that follow, and also show ways that frameworks that we're all probably pretty familiar with, or at least know about, like Fitwel, LEED, align with ESG, because I think it's a way to kind of help ESG make sense. So here's one example. You can go on to Fitwel and find this report. Again, I just pulled a little snip here, but what they're doing is they tried to show alignment with their strategies to what they're calling S metrics. So why we're even talking about this is because it's really easy to measure carbon, right? We know what carbon is, we know how to measure it, we're pretty good at it, generally speaking. S metrics can be tougher, right? How do you describe things like universally accessible restrooms? If you know me, you know I do a lot of talking about accessible restrooms, but how many and what square footage and what does that look like, and how do we take an S metric can be a little bit more difficult. We're going to get better at it. We're not great at it yet, but things like Fitwel are producing resources like this that help us think about, okay, things like access to daylight, views of nature. So they're saying take the percentage of occupants with access to daylight or views of nature, suggesting some ways to put metrics to these things that are kind of new for us to put metrics to, or interior acoustic comfort, exterior acoustic comfort, number of reported noise complaints annually. I'm not sure if that's the best way to measure it, but Fitwel knows a lot about this space and that's what they're suggesting. So could be a good starting point. So this is I think it's a 5 or 7 page kind of summary that they've put out, demonstrating how there's some alignment with S, because if you read a lot about ESG, there's a heavy focus on E. And that's okay, but it's also not okay, right? We need to have a stronger focus on S while keeping that high focus on E. Because again, we can't pull these things apart, right? Those overlapping circles that I was talking about earlier. So, so kind of like applaud, fit well, and others. I'm just giving examples for kind of trying to put these things out there. Similarly, or kind of related, there are another crosswalk that we have. Let me zoom in on this because I realize it's pretty small. Probably recognize those little logos on the side. Those are the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, just pulling two examples of good health and well-being and gender equality. WELL has a crosswalk. They have many, as does Fitwell, demonstrating their alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, which are one type of ESG framework. So they say, among others, I just pulled some examples for the purposes of our slide here, right? But if we look at good health and well-being, as you can imagine, the WELL building standard has quite a few places of alignment. They talk about air quality, smoke-free environment, ventilation design, and then gender equality. They're looking at things like their own, these are sites to their own features, right? CO8, new parent support, CO9, new mother support, C12, diversity and inclusion, things like that. So again, what they're trying to do here is show alignment between certification programs that we all work under and ESG frameworks, so that, like I was saying at the beginning, how can you talk to your clients about how certain things align with ESG or align your own firm's operations? These are ways to do that. And these are new, right? We're going to get better at all this stuff. We're going to get better crosswalks. We're going to, I hope we come to a point in all of our lives where we don't certify projects anymore. We just build really sustainable, healthy, safe, inclusive spaces. We're not there yet. So, you know, we use a series of imperfect tools to kind of try to get us there. So these are just some examples. Here's one like really specific example that I hope I don't lose people on, but GRESB is the kind of real estate specific ESG reporting framework. You actually get a score. It's in that kind of column that I showed that Verdani created of not just like involuntary reporting, but it asks you a bunch of questions and you get a score at the end and you can compare properties. They describe themselves as the global standard. It's based on the Netherlands. The global standard in ESG benchmarking and reporting provides companies, private funds, developers, investors with basically a score that helps them assess risk and opportunity of those assets. Because as you can imagine, when we're thinking about things like climate risk, really expensive buildings and physical assets that are at risk, we want to know, how is that building going to kind of prepare for a changing climate? And then also, how is that space going to welcome all visitors, or is it going to exclude certain visitors? And then we need to kind of know that information. So this is, I will be the first to admit a little bit in the weeds, but I just want to kind of show and give folks or hopefully have some type of familiarity with GRESB, but at least you know what it is. So these are just screen grabs of their questions that might relate to things that we're used to seeing. So one of their questions relates to building certifications. They say, does the entity, so this would be like the ownership entity, development portfolio include projects that are aligned with green building standards? Does the entity's development portfolio projects that are obtained or registered to obtain a green building certification? What's super interesting to me is what's considered a green building certification. There's almost 2 pages of 2 columns. It's a ton of different certifications. And as a lot of us know, those can vary wildly, right? So it's kind of interesting to think about, is this an apples to apples comparison or not? In my mind, as long as we're moving the needle with respect to more sustainable buildings, that's a good thing. We'll get better at this stuff again as we go through. But there are almost 2 pages of what's considered a green building certification in GRESB. And then drilling down, or this is going to look a little out of context, but this is a WELL crosswalk with GRESB that shows various kind of GRESB indicators here, and then they align with IO5, green building rating systems, or a GRESB question is kind of tell us about your community engagement program. Also, they have full alignment with these features like emergency preparedness, civic engagement, emergency resources. I realize this is a little bit out of context. It's difficult to put all of these things on slides. So what this is really saying, and you can go and look at WELL's crosswalk, they have one for the new version 2. Say, okay, if our client is pursuing GRESB, there's various ways that WELL features align either in full, like the examples I've given here, or partially with some of those questions. And so again, obviously all these third-party certification programs are very interested in saying, yes, we align with this because they want projects certified, right? And so there's WELL, Fitwell produces a crosswalk, other green building certification programs do as well. LEED has one out there. So you can go online and look at all those different ones, but there are ways to kind of show alignment with what we're seeing as some of the places where ESG is headed. I'm trying not to make people sick with my zooming in and out, sorry. But anyway, if everybody's okay with that, I'm gonna kind of close out with some key takeaways. Maybe we can chat a little bit, or folks can get on their way. But I hope that was helpful. ESG is changing all the time, and I was talking with a colleague the other day. Like, if someone tells you that they have 10 years of ESG experience, like, run away from that person, because it is new. We're still all learning a lot. There's ways that it impacts different industries differently, but I think the important point to keep in mind is really that it is an opportunity to move all of these conversations on the environmental, social, and governance side forward, that we all desperately need, right? So take a look at ESG reports. Go find one for, I don't know, some XYZ local company that you like, and check it out. Check out your clients' ESG reports, know their goals. I mean, a great thing to do before a meeting for kind of a kickoff project, or just like a kind of ideation session, is what public commitments have you made with respect to climate or social issues? Let's talk about how this project could potentially align with those, and what a value add, I think. And then also seen a lot more firms, really looking at their own operations. What is the diversity of your leadership? Are you looking at your own carbon impacts of either, for service providers tends to be pretty small, but every little bit counts, right? Or focusing on other, pay issues, supply chain diversity, all kinds of different things. How inclusive is your space? I always look, if I walk into your office and I see a gendered restroom, I'm gonna turn around and walk out. Is your office a welcoming space to all of the guests who come in? Do you have a no-step entrance? All these kind of different things. And so we want to make sure that we have a good sense of how you as a service provider, your operations fit in with what your clients' goals ultimately are. And isn't it handy that they publish them and you can go look at them? So, I would do my homework. And then take a look at some of the resources that are out there. I have cited them on various slides. See if I actually put them. I didn't put the links here because they get really, really long. But you can Google lead GRES crosswalk, lead ESG crosswalk, well ESG crosswalk, and find all these things that are out there. And I expect that there will be more as we kind of get used to what's going on and what the SEC is ultimately going to do. So you can check all those things out. And I will kind of pause and or stop there. Stop the recording too. If folks have questions or want to talk something through. Otherwise, you're welcome to reach out to me at my email on that slide.